Hello, everyone. Welcome to Overcoming the Pitfalls of Value Tracking. I'm Matt Stewart, a director in the Community and Learning team here at Automation Anywhere, and I'll be taking all questions at the end of the session, but feel free to chat about anything you find relevant, and I'll chime in on those things later as well. So before we get started, standard safe harbor disclaimer. This presentation might include some forward-thinking statements about our products and vision. And while we're very excited about all of them, I want to remind everyone that the actual development and release of those things is at our discretion and capability. Think of this as a glimpse into our vision ahead. So also, if you've not seen this before, please give a shout out to Micah and join his session on the Pathfinder framework. This framework is a tool that'll help automation teams navigate the complexities of managing an automation program. The material in the session today is aligned with the above dimensions, with value measurement and analytics as the primary, and evangelism and stakeholder management and opportunity identification and pipeline management as secondary. If you're not familiar with these, you can stay tuned. There'll be plenty more content on these coming in the coming months. If you want to get a little bit of a heads up on what that is, tune into Micah Smith's session from yesterday's keynote. So we'll get started on the session then. For the first year of my automation career, I was a developer with a mission to learn how everyone's role around me worked and where my work ultimately came from. And the only word I ever heard people say when asking about automation value was FTEs. How many full-time equivalents will this automation save me? And one day, I naively asked a question that changed my team's outlook on the value that automation can add. To a team we were working with on a project of like $200,000 annual value, I asked, what could you do if you had unlimited employees? And this reframed our conversation from FTE reduction to all the other things that business function served. And that single question resulted in us delivering an automation that ended up driving millions in revenue every year. And Automation Anywhere, the company, not just the product, has long been an advocate of measuring value beyond just FTE reduction. So I'm happy to present to you today ways to think about value measurement and how to interact with your stakeholders to make sure you build the right things for the right reasons. And very importantly, make sure you have everything you need to tell the story of how you're bringing that value to your organization. So let's briefly talk about the general types of metrics that exist. We've consolidated all of them into one of these 5 categories: delivery, execution, financial, operational, and organizational. We're going to hold off on the delivery and the financial, operational, and organizational stuff while we focus on these 2, delivery and execution, and more specifically, why they shouldn't be the place you stop at when assessing or measuring the value your program adds. Delivery metrics are metrics associated with the productionization of an automation solution. These metrics could include how many automations you've developed or how quickly you've developed them, and all the information about who they were delivered for and when come included. Execution metrics are about the number of times an automation runs and only how many times it runs. For example, tracking that you've delivered 10 automations and they each run 5 times a day are metrics that could be captured and reported. Now, both of these metrics, however, do not measure business value. Many automation programs count and report these and then struggle to get adoption or scale because the value they add is not understood. The remaining metrics, financial, operational, and organizational, are those that track value attributable to the automation. So allow me to introduce you to the AIM framework, the Automation Impact Measurement Framework. It's a lot to cover here, so let's break this down a bit to help with readability. First, let's focus on the major groups at the top that we mentioned earlier. We see the 3 major classifications of the framework are financial, operational, and organizational. Financial metrics directly interact with the top and bottom line items or cash management in the organization. This is the space where most organizations focus their automation value measurement, as it's the most easily recognizable and measurable values. Operational metrics show how automation can improve day-to-day operations. It can be about tracking the work item itself, how long it takes, and examining overall business area and see if things are becoming more efficient. Organizational metrics describe how an automation achieves higher level organizational goals. Things a bit more abstracted and indirectly related to the things the automation is touching, but still important nonetheless. Think of these as like enterprise-wide NPS scores, for an example. Okay, down at the bottom, you'll notice those big three align to a direct and indirect spectrum. Financial metrics are more easily measurable, directly coming from the impacted area of the automation. Because of this, they are most commonly the ones reported by automation programs. If you move a little bit down on the spectrum, you'll notice that operational and organizational benefits as you become more indirect and they're less immediately realizable than the financial benefits are. But direct savings categories such as cost savings, cost avoidance, and revenue generation, they're really easy to quantify, while the indirect ones, such as employee experience and social impact, they're harder to assess, but they're really, really important to get long-term buy-in for your program. If you want to make a strategic impact on your organization, measuring only direct benefits is going to be really hard to get there. Most companies struggle with value realization the farther right you go on the spectrum. So let's walk through each of these so that you can get an understanding of how they can be applied. First, direct cost savings. This includes things like reduced labor costs, operational expenses, the most common value generation for automation projects. This includes my favorite FTE reduction, or sometimes hours back, since those are really common ways of measuring that same value. This is probably the easiest one to measure, capture, and report on, and get to use for project approval. It boils down to examining the business goal associated with a process, finding its cost before and after automation, and pointing at the difference as your value add. Once you've identified the cost for a business process, you can project the time savings that will be introduced. This value can be used to justify the build. Once you've deployed the situation, those costs can be measured and a true benefits determined. Common example of applying this to an automation. This automation will reduce headcount by 8 FTEs or 50 hours a day, which will result in $500,000 a year. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this one. One slot over is revenue generation. If cost savings focuses on removing costs while achieving the same business output, revenue generation can be seen as getting more business output for the same costs, specifically by increasing the top line. It's an immediate benefit that's also readily recognizable on paper. Instead of pointing to the difference in cost, you're pointing to the difference in revenue, pre and post automation. It can be a bit trickier to project prior to deployment and development, so it's hard to make a well-informed business case, but nonetheless, this calculation is pretty simple once you're in production. A business process, product, feature, or service now exists in a state that increases revenue, and that revenue can be attributed to this process. A good way to pitch revenue is with the following line of questioning. What are your business goals, and how would you achieve them if you had infinite labor? Just like I did in my naive developer years. Some processes would make money if the labor costs weren't as high, and adding that question in might encourage people to take on new processes that would serve their customers or serve their business area. One more over is cash flow. Cash flow can greatly impact how well a company performs, all other things being equal. The more efficiently the processing of their cash occurs, the better your organization will be. Let me give you an example. Imagine purchasing something for your organization, whether it's software or machinery, and you have to process the invoice and submit the payment before you get that resource. If you take 3 months to go from agreement to acquisition, that's 3 months where both the money and the resource is doing nothing for your organization. Imagine running a bank and having a large amount of money sitting in ATMs. That money's doing nothing. It can't be invested. It can't be lent out. It's just waiting. If you can reduce the amount of time and money that is spent on making that money functional, you can operate towards your other business goals more effectively. The way cash flow typically manifests in an organization is by improved processing time associated with large cash or capital transactions. So the next one down the line starts to get into our operational section. Operational costs begin to focus on costs and values associated with the business, but not necessarily that business process or that cost center itself. Consider the act of consolidating hundreds of users working in multiple systems into a single automated experience. You aren't reducing labor, you aren't changing the top line, but you are impacting the applications and processes associated with those things. Maybe reducing the number of licenses, improving technology processing types, securing data by standardizing channels of transmission. All of these have an impact to the operational entities associated with your business. So we shift farther into the indirect benefit world, we need to stop focusing on just the dollar amount being the single important KPI. You can potentially quantify dollars in the operational and organizational spaces, but it doesn't need to be done. Other types of metrics that could be tracked here are reduction in IT support tickets or manual interventions, improvement in IT process cycle times, reduction in the number of legacy applications, and potentially even reduction in cybersecurity incidents. Notice how these metrics are not entirely associated with the business process that was automated. That's okay. If you can measure and attribute that impact, you can still count that as part of the value of your automation. One slot over. Operational efficiency and scalability. This begins to measure the operational impacts rather than the costs and value associated with the process itself. Despite that, many of these can be quantified, especially cost avoidance. For example, to calculate a value associated with cost avoidance, you might have a cost of 50 employees that process 100 items a day, and you might anticipate growth and need to hire 20% more staff in the coming months, and automation prevents that. There's no change to the bottom or top line, but rather the existing staff has become more capable of processing more work in the same time. You aren't saving money, you aren't making more of it, you've simply avoided the cost by increasing efficiency. It's be largely invisible to the organization, and ironically, it might actually show up as a small cost due to the time spent developing it and supporting it. It's important to understand the difference between the financial nature of the business process and the operational nature. Saying we cut 20% of our staff is one thing and is recognizable to an accountant, but saying the existing staff is more efficient is only going to be visible to the operation teams overseeing that process. Metrics in this category often overlap with metrics in other spaces, but on their own might struggle to get approval for a project without properly aligning to core business KPIs. Other automations that impact this area will also have some financial impact as well, but that'll be measured differently. Next up, and probably very important to a lot of organizations out there, is audit risk and compliance. Without automation, some percentage of work items might be processed incorrectly. And depending on the process, those incorrect items could have a negative impact to the business, to customers, or cause regulatory issues. Many organizations have second lines of defense in place to double check, and then audit teams in place to investigate as many potential issues as possible. Automation can go a long way in increasing accuracy, reducing errors, enhancing audit and second line capabilities as well. And these metrics are intrinsically important as business KPIs. Reducing errors, increasing compliance and accuracy without sacrificing processing time is a huge boon to the organization that might be too indirect for most teams to realize when focusing only on direct benefits, especially those in highly scrutinized processes in highly regulated industries. For organizations that focus heavily here, it might be enough to drive the business case, but if not, consider grouping this with the direct benefits associated with saving hours on the number of auditors, or the cost avoidance with potential fines or errors, or increasing the productivity of auditors. Being able to audit policies and processes faster with no additional costs is a large benefit to an organization. Excuse me. The first of the organizational metrics, customer experience, usually equates to financial benefits, and many companies do invest heavily here. Despite that, automation programs tend to focus only on the financial side and not the KPIs associated with the customer experience itself. So if it takes the same cost and the same time to process a customer request, but the customer rates it as an amazing experience measured either through NPS or some other benchmark, that can meaningfully impact the entire organization. Tracking an automation's impact to a wide variety of customer metrics like that can be a great way to show impact and value to an organization. If your organization has determined that customer experience drives growth or prevents a customer attrition, and you can tie that automation's value into that customer experience improvement, you've given your organization an indirect way of understanding the value of your automation. Similarly, employee experience. It's a quantifiable component that impacts your organization. Attrition rates for unhappy employees, an onboarding experience, or productivity loss from unhappy employees are all impactful to an organization and should be considered as part of an automation's impact. These values could be quantified to a dollar amount if necessary, or they can be left as simple measurements of the happiness, job satisfaction, likeliness to stay, or some other metrics. Either way, it is an additional value measurement. Imagine a project's approval scenario in a customer call center where you can say, introducing this automation will reduce employee turnover by 25%. That's something you've likely never considered, but many automations that reduce the burden of monotonous work on employees who deal with customers all day can go a long way to improving their quality of life and thus reduce turnover. Dollar amount associated with that automation is important, but the dollar amount associated with onboarding and training can be combined in as it's related to the financial and operational metrics with those KPIs associated with the employee experience. And lastly, we have environmental and social impact. These might not directly impact your bottom line, but your organization might consider it an important strategic initiative because of public image or simply because of the good it does to the world. If some stakeholder at your organization is spearheading an initiative that focuses on sustainability or equity, and there is a measurement they use, identifying it and determining how you can align your automation to it could be a huge impact for you. As an example, digitizing everything through automation will greatly reduce paper waste. Ink and paper are two hugely expensive items, and both financially and environmentally. Another example, human in the loop can increase workplace accessibility. If automation can meet those objectives, there's no reason to ignore it. Okay, so we've covered all of those. And just to be clear, any single automation isn't restricted to just one type of value. Instead, you could potentially be measuring every single one of these for any automation. You might have noticed that some of these overlap as we went through, and this can happen for two reasons. First, different metrics can matter to different stakeholders. For example, finance teams might prioritize top or bottom line savings, while operation or IT teams might focus on performance or processing efficiency. The same automation could deliver value to both groups, but they both interpret the impact differently and care about different things. A financial stakeholder might view 20% reduction in staff interacting with an application as cost savings, while an operations manager could see it as a measure of improved process efficiency. Similarly, reducing infrastructure costs might matter to IT, while finance interprets it as a budgetary gain. Understanding which metrics resonate with which group is essential to effectively communicating the benefits of your program and getting increased buy-in. Second, the same automation can produce multiple impacts across different dimensions. For instance, automating a call center process might save money by improving efficiency while simultaneously enhancing employee working conditions. Reduced attrition from happier employees could also lower recruiting costs, while the better trained, happier employees and more engaged staff will improve customer satisfaction and reduce IT needs. These diverse benefits demonstrate how one automation can create a ripple effect over time. However, these impacts might be overlooked by organizations or programs measuring only cost savings. Identifying and aligning these impacts with the appropriate metrics ensures that their value is fully realized across the organization. Now, you've heard me talk a lot about metrics so far. You've also heard me mention the stakeholders. So let's start talking about those stakeholders and who they are and what they're interested in. First, you'll notice that we've declared there are 4 types of stakeholders. There's obviously a lot more people and titles and roles at your organization that care about these things, but we've bundled them into these 4 categories because of the shared interests. So let me introduce you to those 4. C-suite executives are those that lead your company, and they make the most strategic decisions. Department heads can appear across a variety of levels within the organization. Think of those as the owners of a business segment or process. An automation might perform work for a group of 10 people, and one of those people is the manager of the group. That person can be considered a department head. And so with their manager and their manager and their manager and so on until you reach the C-suite. IT managers are the non-business stakeholders exclusively on the technology side. They're not involved in the business process itself. These might be people who support the infrastructure, do change management or project management, or handle risk and security at your organization. Automation leads are you. They're people like you. If you're in a federated center of excellence or you have other crews or pods of development happening at your org, the automation leads are the people who manage those pods, or their peers on your team if you work in a team that has other product leads or other workers in the space. So you as an automation leader, you fit into that bottom category. Now, let's talk about what metrics these people care about. Imagine your automation program as a business. Each of these stakeholders are a different type of customer. Different customers care about different things, and trying to prove to them to invest in your automation program, your business, is critical to growing. Maintaining funding and getting new projects started and building a story and reputation for yourself and your program. Let's look at each of these metrics and how they care about them. C-suite executives typically care about the large-scale strategic decisions that impact the entire organization. One of the organization's biggest priorities is profitability, so it's no wonder one of their primary concerns is going to be the financial impact of the program and the automations released. They're going to want to know how much your program costs, how much its financial value is, and how much it brings to the organization. And while it's true that operational metrics might tell some of the same story, these leaders aren't going to want to get too deep in the day-to-day how it's done of the solutions. C-suite executives might also be champions of a specific organizational goal, such as NPS scores, employee retention, or something else that stretches across the organization. If they have that interest, it might be wise to be able to speak about the ways your program and its automation solutions impact it. Department heads are those involved in either the day-to-day processing of work items, like managing the staff that does the work, or managing the product or service the items are within. Imagine a department head managing 20 people that processes customer requests, and you want to introduce an automation to his organization. Directly discussing FTE reduction might work, but you'd inevitably have to answer questions about how the work will be reduced and how that automation would work, what the implications of the work being done, and a bevy of other questions that would be better addressed if you just focused on operational and organizational metrics first and foremost. Department heads want to know how the work or product they own will be impacted, as well as how the people who do the work or interact with the product are impacted. They want to know how much the work item has reduced in handle time. They want to know what level of accuracy the automation has helped achieve. They want to know if the employees are happier with the tools removing mundane work from them. They want to know how their customers are feeling as the product experience shifts due to automation. Now, IT managers, being exclusively on the technology side, they generally only care about the delivery and execution metrics. I did mention that these metrics are not the primary goal of automation programs, and that's still true, but it doesn't mean that some people aren't interested and need to know. IT managers need to know what technologies exist across the organization, how much it costs to build, how much it costs to run, how long they'll be running for, how often they're running, why they're running. These are the people that are most likely to be involved in change management, business resiliency groups, or site reliability. They want to know what works, what doesn't work, how many exist, and across all the lines of business. Something needs to go into production. These people aren't going to ask you about the customer service implications. They're going to ask you whether or not it's going to create a problem for them on Saturdays. Lastly, being that you, as an automation leader, need to be able to communicate these metrics to every stakeholder, and you need to be able to talk about all of the metrics. Every automation leader, peer, or person under you needs to understand what these metrics mean, how to interpret them, and how to communicate their meaning to the right people. Now, back to the metaphor of your automation program being a business. If one of these customers reaches out to your business team or needs to be able to understand what's being asked, this group needs to be able to answer it. Sorry, I skipped one slide too far ahead. Yeah, you need to be able to answer that question. So we're not going to dive too deeply into project management or development life cycles. I just wanted to give you a little bit of context on what the coming slides are talking about. Now, knowing which metric to capture, which stakeholder to report to can be tricky, and it might seem like a really large initiative, but fortunately it fits right into traditional process discovery or intake management and project management workflows. I'm not going to get into all 5 of these stages. I'm just going to focus on where stakeholder engagement and alignment portions fit. So first, discovery is the act of identifying an automation opportunity. It might be done proactively, where your team goes out into the organization to find things to automate, or it could be done passively with an idea submission process or other intake. Whichever process you follow, the result is the same. You're going to have an automation opportunity that you're considering for deployment and development. Design is where you design a solution that will solve that problem. Development is where you build, test, and demo what was just designed. And while we won't be covering anything there, it's important to know that. Deployment is the productionization of that build, making it actually work in production for real. We're not going to be covering anything there either. Diligence is all the ongoing effort that happens after it's been deployed. We won't explicitly cover anything here, but just know that anything you commit to in discovery and design happens here. This is where you're actually doing the value tracking and the reporting. This is just executing on the promises that you've made. So this should provide some brief context for the following slides. It isn't possible to properly identify an opportunity if you haven't considered all the potential ways of measuring the value that it brings to the organization. So to do that appropriately, you need to take the following steps before the discovery phase. Before discovery, mind you, these are events that should be done at your program level before any discovery of any specific use cases occurs. First, start by identifying metrics within the organization's goals. These are things that exist outside of any single process. These are things like customer focus efforts that exist across all lines of business, technology consolidation efforts, employee satisfaction initiatives, sustainability initiatives, etc. These are not process specific. Second, you need to align your reporting to those corporate objectives. Not all organizational goals are the same, and the way that the project interacts with them will vary, so it's good to get a sense of what you're targeting. Here's an example. If employee retention is an organizational initiative, and they report on this by tracking total attrition rates per line of business, you need to consider what you can do with that information to tell the story of what your future automation's impact is. If you find an opportunity and build something amazing, how could it be reflected in those metrics? It could be that you show pre and post deployment scores for that business domain. Or it could be that you want to measure impact at the process level to show that processes with automation inside of a domain have a lower likelihood of attrition. Knowing what those metrics are and what your strategy is for measuring them is crucial to avoid extra work later. That extra work being people asking you, does this make an impact or not? I apologize. So lastly, you need to define any secondary metrics. Those secondary metrics are the delivery and execution metrics. And I know they aren't the sexy metrics that I've been saying really measure business value, but to be seen as the real strategic technology partner, you have to have a formalized way of measuring these things. Fortunately, it doesn't require any additional discovery work on a per use case level. It's just able to be determined far in advance. To do this, just talk to the IT managers, the change management groups, the other risk organizations, and adhere to whatever their standard is. Large organizations have a technology standard, and as long as you're able to report in alignment with those, they'll take you seriously and you won't be seen as a shadow IT org. Finally, for each of these, consider short-term and long-term needs. It's one thing to be able to report on a per execution or daily value add, and another altogether to show value trends over time. So let's move on to the during process discovery stage. This stuff happens on a per use case basis. First, you need to identify all potential stakeholders. C-suite executives generally don't change that much. Depending on your organization where you're automating, there might be a different one particularly interested in or acting as a sponsor for the automation. There are likely a lot of department heads to track down. And IT managers usually aren't interested in any metrics at this point, but identifying any new ones that require conversation won't hurt. You've already defined how you'll be communicating and tracking deployment and execution metrics you can share with them. Identifying automation leaders that have an interest in this space might help or have additional insight is very helpful as well. In a federated COE, this might already be a joint discovery venture that they'd be involved in, but in the case that they aren't yet involved, now is the time to bring them in since we haven't started on specific things. Second, learn what they care about. Learn what their business goals are and what costs they have in achieving them. Learn how they quantify success. You will need to get to this important question of how will we measure that the automation is working? If they measure their employees' productivity by number of widgets per hour, you need to know that. If one stakeholder tracks how many overtime hours are needed to maintain an SLA, then that needs to be documented as success criteria. Leverage the AIM framework to determine all the potential metrics that are important to the process. Leave no stone unturned. Then discuss the benchmarks. Measuring a metric to determine if you've achieved that goal or how. What is the benchmark that you're going to use as your criteria? If you declare you want to impact customer experience, a reasonable benchmark might be that you've achieved a 5-point NPS score, or maybe you've reduced processing time by 20%. Set break-even points as well. A break-even point would be a number that says, if we aren't achieving this value, then something is wrong. This is an important differentiation from goal benchmarks because you can have a goal of 100, get a 90, and still be happy. But if you have a goal of 100 and get a 10, maybe you need to re-examine your process assumptions. These numbers can even act as a kill switch. If you put something into place with the goal of reducing processing time by some number and that metric does not improve, you need to acknowledge you've introduced technical debt, additional cost, and effort into maintaining something that isn't working. What's the minimum value that you need to keep this thing running? If you don't hit that break-even point, maybe it's time to turn the automation off. All right, during design, this one can get a little bit complicated. Assessing downstream and upstream and parallel processes and then validating all the metrics are attainable. I think if I just showed you a visual, it'd make a lot more sense. So imagine that you've got a customer request coming in and being processed by two teams in parallel. Might not seem like it happens that often, but as you diagram out interrelated processes at your org, you'll see this happening far more often than you think. Right? Team 1 and team 2 work on this side by side, takes a little bit of effort and there's a short backlog, but they get the work done generally at the same pace and the system is updated and the customer got their request closed. Now imagine that team 2's work is automated and that the metrics that we agreed upon were FTE reduction and customer experience. FTE reduction in this area is achieved by the removal of employees from team 2. However, the assumption was that by automating Team 2's work, the customer's request would be handled faster and improve customer experience scores. However, when looking at this view, we can see that Team 1 hasn't been impacted. So the overall request time does not change because Team 1's contribution takes just as long. If you don't look at the related processes, then you'll miss this and end up in production with attempting to achieve a metric that's not achievable. Had you done this analysis first, it would have been evident that the correct step would have been move some of Team 2's resources to Team 1 as part of the overall automation initiative. It would have reduced your overall FTE goal, but it would have ensured that your customer experience metrics were achieved. Remember, automation should not just be a cost takeout play or thought about on a per project basis, but it should be part of a strategic initiative to transform your organization. Additionally, these same concepts apply to upstream and downstream processes where dependencies or blockers can appear outside of the automation that will prevent you from achieving a specific metric. This exercise will help you ensure the promised metrics are achievable by adapting resource planning or design prior to build time. And I will admit, this process is one of the most difficult to master, but as you can see, it will help determine how automation is introduced to your organization, how its success is understood, while also saving you some of the pain points that come later when the automations are perceived to not be living up to their goals. So during design, the second stage, now that you've defined the desired metrics and identified all the surrounding processes and you know what's achievable, you need to find the data. For each of the desired metrics, figure out what data would be needed to complete the measurements and figure out how you'll access that data. For direct savings such as FTE reduction or revenue generation, the data to calculate these might not come from the automation itself, but rather another system. HR might be able to report cost center employee info, while a CRM or finance team or even the department head might be able to provide you that information on revenue generation. In the instance that it does need to come from the automation, these need to be understood at this point so that requirements for development are appropriately set. It is far easier to build metric capturing and reporting into an automation than it is to rebuild it or answer those questions later. For each of the metrics and data requirements, make sure that these allow you to calculate those benchmarks that you set during discovery. It's a verification step where you ensure the commitments that you made can work. If one thing is going to be able to provide some measurement for that, it's an entirely another thing. That metric does not actually align to the stakeholders' needs. If you say we improved customer response time by 30%, but they want to know what it means as an NPS score, then your measurement doesn't mean anything to them and they won't care. You have to align on the way that they want it to be discussed, and you need to make sure that the data that is available to you will allow you to validate those measurements and present it that way. Lastly, proactive alignment. Once you've gathered everything, review it with those stakeholders. You can explain how each metric will be measured, what data will be used, and where that data will be sourced. This allows you to get full agreement in advance of going forward with a build. In the event you can't get access to some of that data, or the data won't be robust enough to answer specific questions, consider if that's a deal breaker. If the most important metric was revenue and a secondary metric was employee experience, maybe it isn't that big of a problem that you can't track this automation's impact on employee experience. The stakeholders might be able to work that out at the organizational level and still be okay. You don't know until you've had that conversation. If you proceed without this recap, it's just as bad as proceeding without proper technical requirements. You're risking a future where the business is unhappy with the automation because they don't know if it's working. You also lose out on the opportunity to have something that is looked at as a key contributor to their success. And by that, I mean, having this review shows them that you clearly understand what they expect from you and that your automation is important. It isn't secondhand. It isn't an afterthought. When they see that impact in their organization, they see that it was you and your alignment with their goals. They will understand that you had this impact and that it didn't just happen. Okay, so some of the common pitfalls. Disagreements do happen, though they're much more rare if you align the way we've been discussing in advance. Then again, you probably already have some automations in production and you've heard some of these complaints before. So let's go over a few of these types of disagreements and ways to address them. First, data accuracy disputes. You probably have an automation that tracks some number of work items, it processes, and how long that process takes. And there might be another group tracking the exact same thing outside of the process. If a stakeholder approaches you and challenges you with your numbers don't match our numbers, then you most likely have a data accuracy dispute. You'll remember earlier we discussed aligning with the shareholder exactly how you'll be doing the measurement for those metrics. If that step wasn't done for this automation, you're at risk of running into this problem. You need to go back and have that exercise. Consider it that if a team brought in conflicting data to that stakeholder, but they knew how your measurement was done, they'd be able to reconcile those differences without needing to call you. Then again, it also might be a genuine conflict, and these can happen. Sometimes automations only process certain use cases, or their scope of measurement was different from another team's, and it's slightly beyond what the automation has access to, and it'll be missing in your scenario. Whatever the case, knowing what you have and what you're measuring with this automation will simplify the way that you resolve this problem. Sometimes a stakeholder will just tell you without any supporting information that your data is wrong. And as the automation leader, you will need to investigate far more about that assumption than just simply saying no, especially to maintain trust and good standing with that stakeholder. It's possible that there's a coding error and it's missing information, or it's possible the stakeholder is incorrect. To solve this, asking questions into why they think you're wrong is key. They might think it's wrong because the value they thought they'd be seeing isn't happening or isn't being felt. If they say the data is wrong, they're more likely communicating, I'm not seeing the results I thought I would based on the data. They might be wrong, or there might have been other assumptions made in discovery and design that failed to account for the true impact of your process. If a simple reason isn't found, like a coding error, a revisit of those discovery and design steps might be needed. Second, process context issues. For automations that did not go through that relatedness assessment I mentioned earlier, These types of issues are hard to deal with after the fact. But doing this assessment as a tool to diagnose the root cause of the lack of metric achievement is still good because it helps place context around the automation. It might help lead to the next steps in automation as well. If you discover a related process, maybe that becomes the target of your next release, and then all of the original promised value can be achieved. For automations that did go through this assessment and still face trouble, it could be because of unintended consequences and unforeseen impacts of the automation interacting with a related process. Fortunately, this is very rare, so it's not something I recommend trying to proactively predict, but if it happens, the same type of mapping exercise that was recommended can help identify what interaction has occurred. As an example, let's revisit that Team 1 and Team 2 flow. Imagine that by automating one of the two flows, the total number of customer follow-up requests has decreased. And those follow-up requests might have always gotten 5-star feedback and acted as an artificial boon to the customer experience metric. By removing the opportunity for human interaction on follow-up requests and preventing good customer experience scenarios from happening at the start by the automation, you've inadvertently decreased the total number of surveys, specifically positive ones, and thus impacted that metric negatively. Like I said, this is rare, and proactively identifying these requires an extremely detailed understanding the inner workings of your process to predict in advance. So it's better to just do regular alignment. Both of those pitfalls and disagreements are things that really shouldn't be possible if you executed the earlier alignment strategies, but for existing automations, these following sessions will be useful. Data limitations. Sometimes the data necessary to measure something does not exist. And when this is realized after an automation is already running, it can be problematic. If this was a core metric and the primary reason the automation was built, it's doubly problematic. At this point, a difficult decision needs to be made by both you and the stakeholders. Use these questions to help make the decision of whether the automation should keep running. Are the measurable metrics valuable enough? This is an important question because while the key metric isn't measurable, other things might be. Remember, the AIM framework has 9 categories. Just because you can't accurately gauge the most important one to these stakeholders doesn't mean you can't measure others. Second question, is the amount we can measure detailed enough? While the existing data doesn't support precisely knowing the impact, is there enough data to know that it has some positive impact? Enough of a positive impact? Is it enough that you believe it justifies the cost of the automation? If you can't prove that it's something adding value, it might be time to turn it off. Finally, definition disagreements. A mismatch in key terms is simple to understand. The metric names or definitions you used differ from the ones the stakeholder use. The automation value report might say, we're improving processing times by 12%, but processing time isn't a metric they care about, or they don't call it processing time. This is cured by just having a simple realignment exercise that we described earlier. If the measurements are not being done to their expectations, it can be harder to rectify though. Here's one example that can be solved just by changing the measurement. If I report an automation has achieved a reduction of workforce by 8 full-time employees, but the stakeholders calculate a different number, it could be because they measure FTEs not by 8 hours a day, but by 6.5. I had that experience once and it confused the heck out of me. Variation in calculating productive hours or some other metric can result in you presenting incorrect metrics. Something like that is just a simple recalculation as long as you already have all the data you need to do that measurement. In other situations, the measurements for a specific metric might require different data altogether, at which point you find yourself back at the data limitations. Okay, so I know that this was an incredibly dense session with a lot of information that is way harder to do than I made it sound. So here's a few other things to help you out. First, talking to stakeholders can be hard, and I kind of left that part out. Sometimes they don't want to be bothered, they just want to see results. Kate Ressler presented a session earlier today called The Art of the Automation Pitch that talks about how to get through to a stakeholder and have the conversations about what type of value you bring. Second, some of those interrelated process things probably made your eyes roll if you've never seen that type of thinking before. That kind of stuff can be really difficult, especially when everyone is talking a different language. Fortunately, I hosted a session yesterday that explains a great design framework to help with that. I am a little biased, but I think it was great. It focuses on reducing the complexity of process design to business information rather than a lot of technical jargon. These QR codes will bring you to the Bizibo link as long as you're already logged into Bizibo. I'll leave these sessions up here and we can open up the floor to Q&A. Do we have any questions from chat? I do not see anything. Hi, Larkin. Welcome to the stage.
Hello. Thank you, Matt. It's been awesome to listen to this. We don't have any questions yet, but folks, please do add any in the chat or in the Q&A, and we can get those answered for you.
And if you see this and then you go and watch one of those other two sessions and you have other ideas, you can post on our community forum and we'd be glad to talk about them with you there. You can also message us directly on LinkedIn or in the Bizibo platform, and we'd be glad to take any questions there as well.
Matt, I thought this was so interesting. I'm curious, since you spent many years as an automation dev and leader, what are some other examples of metrics surprises that you had?
So let me share a story of, I mentioned it in Kate's session a little bit ago. We had a collection of technologies that could be used in very specific ways, but nobody was using those technologies in that way because the value that those ways would add were not the things that were approved for project funding at the organization. And so because of that, we couldn't build things that would really add value. One thing that we wanted to introduce was a conversational agent that would help people in the care center find information and interact with some of the legacy systems across the organization. Well, it wasn't going to save time, it wasn't going to save money, it wasn't going to reduce labor, but we had a 25% turnover rate in our care center. If these people didn't feel like they were getting thrown to the wolves every day because they didn't need to know a million things to do their job, they wouldn't be quitting and we'd be saving money. But employee experience wasn't an approvable metric. So we had to go through a pretty convoluted exercise of figuring out the exact cost associated with hiring, the exact cost associated with attrition and training and unproductive hours, so that we could say an employee attrition rate of 4% is equal to X dollars, and an employee attrition rate of 3% is equal to Y dollars. That allowed us to get funding for these things. So I had to do these types of metric workshops with different groups and figure out a way that we could align what the organization really cared about with what our technical capabilities were. And if we had just had that available to us at the start, I think there would have been so many more things getting built, adding value across the organization.
Yeah, that's a really cool example. We see that here too, because there can be things that we instinctively know are going to add a ton of value for the team, but it's hard to figure out how to quantify that. So cool. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, and that thing that I was calling out as being very rare, I've only seen it twice in my career. So when I was saying it's very rare and don't worry about proactively, I wasn't trying to scapegoat. I've been doing automation now for 7 or 8 years, and I've only seen it happen twice. The other time happened in the care center as well, and I'll share it with you guys in case it's something you run into. Most people introduce AI and automation into a care center with the goal of improving the customer experience, with the goal of improving the amount of money they spend in the cost center to deliver those gains. And the way that they generally measure the success of a call center is metrics like average call handle time, first call resolution. There's a couple of things like that. So you think that if you were to introduce automation or technology capabilities that allow customers to self-serve. Think of like if you call a company and you've got a digital AI assistant that they're talking to that allows them to reset their passwords, fix whatever problem before ever making it to an employee, you are by definition removing the easy problems from the pool. So the traditional metric of handle time being like 7 minutes for a goal is no longer achievable because the hard ones are making it through. If you go in and think, I'm going to reduce my handle time down really, really low because of AI and automation, you might be measuring the wrong thing and thinking that your automation is causing harm when really all of the easy ones are gone. So the result is the hard ones come through and require more time to handle. So that was the only other example that I had, and understanding the implications of what you're putting in place and how it might impact your existing metrics is an important thing to think about.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a ton of sense. You have to really think about not just, what are our current goal metrics, but why do we even have those goals?
Mm-hmm.
And, do we need to change up how we measure our
Yeah.
our true goal? Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. Well, we have a couple of questions from the audience here, so let me add them in.
Awesome.
Um, One is, this is a new way of thinking for me. Any tips for how to start shifting from focusing on delivery into thinking more about these strategic benefits?
So I mentioned that anecdote of when I was a very young developer asking the naive question. That one
Hmm.
is really foundational because it wasn't focused on the cost savings part, right? That question of what would you do if you had infinite labor? People start talking about why their organization or why their specific role in the organization exists at all. Like like I have a team of 3 people and we build a lot of content. And I'm not going to say, hey, ChatGPT can help us. I only need 2 people. What I might say is, hey, if I had ChatGPT plus 1 million people, we'd be able to make more content. I'd be able to achieve my goals better. So instead of talking about what you do and trying to align it to technical capabilities to also do it, ask them more questions about what is the goal of your program, like where do you add value to the org, because if you know how they add value, you can move towards adding more value to them. There was a quote that I said in my last session. I'm going to repeat it because it was well liked there too. Companies who focus their AI and automation efforts on cost reduction will fall behind companies who use AI and automation to grow. And I think that's the way you need to be thinking about things. Don't go into a work center attempting to use your technology to replace the work they're doing. Think about augmenting the work they're doing.
Yeah, cool. This is awesome. All right. Well, it looks like we don't have any other questions coming in right now, but as Matt said, we're here on the community forum every day. So if you think of other ones, please do add them there.
All right, great.
All right. Thank you so much, Matt. Thank
Thank
you
you.
everyone for joining.
Take care.